everybody, I'm James Hester and welcome back to the School of Mars. So even though today we're lucky that we have increasing access to better and better, more accurate reproductions of arms and armor for living history or for historical martial arts practice, it still isn't quite the same of being able to hold an original centuries-old object in your hands. And so I'm a big believer that where the opportunity presents itself, people should take every chance to get into museum collections, private collections they're given access to, in order to study these originals up close. It really does alter your perspective on these objects. So when you go to these places, it's important to have an understanding of how to handle the objects safely, what to do, and more importantly, what not to do in order to ensure that the objects aren't damaged, or indeed ensure that you aren't damaged while you're handling them. So even though typically a curator or whoever else is in charge of taking care of these objects will normally give you a crash course before you actually start picking things up, it's really helpful to go in already having a grounding in some of these basic points. So I wanted to take a chance today to go over some basic tips on how to handle objects if you get the chance to study them up close. So first things first, with the exception of certain private collections where the owners aren't as bothered about such things, normally if you go to a museum or some other similar institution, you're going to be expected to wear gloves when you're handling the objects. And the main reason for this, especially when you're dealing with metallic objects, is that your hands, no matter how clean you keep them, have natural salts and oils in them that over time, as if they get in contact with the metal, it will seep in and at first tarnish and then eventually etch the surface. So that's why museums and similar places tend to be so adamant about wearing gloves when handling the objects. It really does make a difference as far as making sure that they stay in good condition in the long term. So normally there are two types of gloves that you can wear: cotton gloves or latex gloves. And both of these have their pros and cons. Cotton gloves, for example, they're reusable. Once they get grotty enough, you can chuck them in the wash and reuse them again. They also tend to keep your hands from getting too sweaty while you're working because they breathe a little bit. However, the cotton will trap and accumulate gunk much more easily, so you do have to keep washing them in order to keep them in good condition, so you're not cross-pollinating crud from one object to another. Also, threads have a tendency to catch on jagged edges of things, which could leave gradually the fingertips and other places unraveling, so you have to be careful with that. Whereas latex gloves, they're one-use disposable, so once you use a pair, you can chuck them away, so it makes it a lot easier to not have to worry about washing them. But it also means that you have to bring a quantity with you in order to get the work done if you're looking at large numbers of objects. Also, because the latex is very thin, if it catches on a sharp edge or a jagged edge, it has a tendency to tear, so you have to be really careful not to suddenly have bare exposed bits of your hands where bits of the latex have been ripped away. Also, they tend to if you're working long shifts studying, your hands very slowly marinate inside them, and it's just a generally unpleasant feeling. So there's trade-offs for both. So most of the time a museum will have a preference that you'll just be expected to keep to, but if you have the choice, that's kind of your trade-offs with either one. When an object is brought out to you, it's important that you do as much of the examination of the object as possible without picking it up off the table. This will reduce the amount of wear and kind of strain that the object has in the long run, so it'll be a lot less likely to gradually suffer loosening of bits or strain on weak spots. So, the less we pick these things up, the better. So it's important that you do as much of your measurements and photography and the like without manipulating the object as much as possible. And only after these bits are done where you have other types of examination that does require you to pick up the object, then pick up the object and start on those tasks. One particular note for edge weapons that might still have their original scabbard. A lot of times it's a good idea to let the curator or the caretaker draw these from the scabbards themselves. They'll obviously know what to do. They'll know if a particular one is weak in certain places, and they'll make all the necessary precautions in order to make sure that it's done safely. Same thing with putting it back again. However, if you are trusted to do this under their supervision, it's generally a good idea to let the scabbard stay flat on whatever surface it is. If it's, say, a rack in a storage place or even on the table, to let the scabbard lie flat with as much contact with a single surface as possible, and then gently slide the sword or the dagger in and then eventually back out again. And you do this very, very slowly because you're trying to feel for any points where it might catch, in which case you want to stop and either have the specialist finish off or just very gently see if it can be maneuvered past that without putting any extra strain. Likewise, the other reason for making sure that the scabbard stays flat is that the scabbard is very often a very, very delicate piece in and of itself. Even metallic scabbards, if you're holding it, say, horizontal or even at a slight vertical, and then draw the weapon out, there's a chance that the stability of the weapon is providing a lot of stability for the scabbard. So when that's removed, if there are any fragile spots in there, then very abruptly the scabbard could kink or even break in those places. So you have to be very, very careful with that. So when we finally do pick up the object, even if it's quite small and light, just for safety's sake, it's a good idea to always start with, and where at all possible maintain, 2 points of contact that distribute the weight of it evenly. So with this finely crafted example, you'd want one hand more or less floating down towards the base and one hand up towards the middle, so that there's no one part of the object that's taking any extra weight as a result. So you wouldn't necessarily want to hold it just by here, because then you have all this weight creating a lot of pressure here, and likewise from this side. So two hands on the object where at all possible. And when you do have to manipulate it, you just let your hands kind of slide and hover in these areas, so that in the event that it stumbles, you're able to recover it without there being any danger of dropping it, and also to maintain that weight distribution so that there's no strain points. When we're manipulating the object and we're moving it around, we want to do so very slowly and very deliberately. It's very important that we not make any very sudden jerky movements, because again, that will place strain under any spots that might be fragile. Likewise, tempting as it is, even with very robust, say, swords, it's generally frowned upon to actually grasp it and even do any very, very slow kind of manipulations, unless you get the express permission of the caretakers to do so, because they'll know whether or not it's robust enough to do that without causing it any harm. But if you do want to get a sense of balance, say, of a weapon, or grab onto the handle and get a sense of its feel, you can still do so, but just keep your offhand just kind of hovering in this area, so the event you have to recover, you can do so very quickly. So that same slow and deliberate manipulation of the object applies not just to objects like swords or daggers, but also especially to armor, which will frequently have bits of articulation. You want to make sure that you're supporting the points of articulation where at all possible, because either the metal lames themselves or some of the underlying leather or textile that might be joined with it could also be very, very fragile. So you want to make sure that it doesn't get any kind of sharp jarring movements that could damage anything. If you do need to manipulate the armor, again, you want to do this very, very slowly and cautiously at first, because lames might be either rusted or otherwise corroded, and so you don't want to try to force anything by trying to move it too quickly too soon. So you always want to try to feel it out very, very gently to see if it's actually pliable, and only then can you start to move it more and more, again, under the watchful eye of the specialist who will be helping to look after you. So when we're carrying these objects, if we have to move, say, from the rack to the table or from a table to a cart, it's important, again, maintaining 2 points of contact on the object and keeping it in front of you at all times. You don't necessarily want to be carrying it kind of down by the side, because the edges could end up banging on things or on people. So having it in front of you where you have a complete consciousness of every part of the object as you're moving it at all times is best practice. If you're moving the objects long distances, not just from a rack to the table or so on, if there is a cart available for you to put it on there and to wheel it those long distances, that's the best thing, because then you make sure that the object is well protected and well supported, and not in danger of being damaged if you were to, say, trip, if you were taking it up and down hallways and that sort of thing. So to wrap up, the most important point above and beyond everything that I've covered here today is, when in doubt about either anything that I've covered or anything that I haven't, that you have thoughts about, can I do this with it? I need to do this for the examination, but I'm not sure. Ask. It's always important to ask the caretakers before you try anything in an examination, because again, they'll have the best knowledge of the object, what it can take, what it can't, what they would prefer done to them and what they would prefer isn't done to them, and you will lower their blood pressure and increase their respect for you immensely if you ask first before trying anything as part of your examination. It makes such a big difference. So hopefully with those few tips you'll be able to go in a little more forearmed and confident to your study visit to any kind of museum. If there are any further questions that you might have, by all means leave a question in the comments and I'll fill you in. If I get enough of them, then I'll make an addendum to this, answering some of those other questions that people might have. But for now, thanks for your attention and see you next time.